What's up guys, the Strong Boys 19 here. This is the next review for Pink Floyd's discography, and since that I had reviewed their previous album, The Final Cut, it's time to review Pink Floyd's 13th studio album entitled A Momentary Lapse of Reason. A Momentary Lapse of Reason came out in 1987, and it is the follow-up to their previous album, The Final Cut. As I spat on my laptop someplace, I apologise. This is the first Pink Floyd album to have Richard Wright back in the band and without Roger Waters, since he left in 1985 to begin his solo career at the time. So David Gilmour is on recording, songwriting and vocal duties. This is easily a very big change of sound when you compare it to The Final Cut, and some Floyd fans would say that this is more of like a solo album by David Gilmour, just like when people say that The Final Cut is Roger's solo album, which I kind of agreed to a certain extent, but Mason and Wright were more present at this time than what they went through with Roger on The Final Cut. The album cover is one of my favourites, and it shows hundreds of hospital beds, and it was located at Salton Sands in Devon. Storm Thorgerson, along with his colleague Colin Elgee, did work with this album, along with the photographer Robert Dowling, who eventually won a Gold Award. One thing I forgot to mention from my Final Cut review, Thorgerson was not present when that album was made because the album cover was done by Roger himself, along with his brother-in-law Willie Christie. So as an album, this is one of the really underrated, underappreciated albums in Floyd's entire catalogue. There are some high positive merits, but as some negatives. But let's go to the positives first. The production of this is really, really good. I do like this one. It's not as polished like The Final Cut, in my opinion, but the drum sound is really good. Same with the guitar tones and the overall sound of it, done by Bob Ezrin, who worked with Floyd on some of their previous albums. Some of the instrumentation on some tracks can be very catchy, like the leading single, Learning to Fly, and some of the songs can be quite dark in places, like on the aggressive protest song, The Dogs of War, which is another really good sounding track. On the Turning Away is more of the power ballad piece of this album, and another track that is really good on here is Sorrow, which is the last track, and it is the longest song on the album, which does contain lyrics that Gilmour had been writing before the music was written for it. But I think Sorrow is another one of the best sounding tracks, and I think Gilmour's vocal performances on most of this album is really good, considering that he was going to do that for the rest of the band's career after Roger Waters had left, because he was the primary singer-songwriter. But I would give Gilmour a lot of props to continue the band as a three-piece and as the singer-songwriter for this period of time. And this is the first Pink Floyd album that was involving a houseboat that Gilmour had bought called Astoria, and it's a beautiful houseboat, and Gilmour had used it as a recording studio to record this album, along with the other Pink Floyd albums, to some of his solo stuff. The first half of this album is really, in my opinion, the better half than the second half. The negatives, unfortunately, personally, the second half is really nowhere near as strong as most of the tracks on the first half. The lyrical content was really decent and enjoyable on most of them, but on the second half, it's where the lyrics have gone even more, I would say, completely bland and generic, like on the song Yet Another Movie, uninspired lyricism with some really uninteresting, very repetitive instrumentation that just doesn't really go anywhere for me. And the two tracks of A New Machine, I just don't understand why they're on this album. I just find them to be completely uninteresting. They are just two little snippets like bookends of just Gilmour's vocals with the sounds of synthesizers and the vocoder on his vocals. They are nothing special. But Terminal Frost, one of the instrumentals, I think is decent. It is one of the decent sounding tracks. The second half that falls pretty much flat on its face by a lot of levels. Some poor execution on the lyricism and the songwriting, and some moments Gilmour strains his voice a little bit when he tries to sing higher notes. But, you know, I would give Pink Floyd at this point quite a lot of credit that they were trying to go to a different sound that they feel really comfortable with. There are other instruments that are involved in this album, including the synthesizers to the vocoders and some drum machines, and not all of the drums were done by Nick Mason. Jim Keltner did some of it on this record, saxophone playing, and they were done by Scott Page and Tom Scott, and there's quite a little bit of percussion here and there, but I would say that A Momentary Lapse of Reason is a really enjoyable listen. While the final cut does have some really good merits, despite the gripes that I said from that album, there are some tracks on this record that I would listen to over some of them on the final cut. So not everything is done perfectly well in terms of execution because of what I said really on the second half, but this album does have its merits. This is pretty much like an above average album that I would really give this album for. So in terms of a rating, I would like to give A Momentary Lapse of Reason by Pink Floyd a 6.5 out of 10. Very enjoyable album for what it is, but it still just does not stand the test of time as one of the better Pink Floyd albums like some of the previous material. So let me know what you think of A Momentary Lapse of Reason down in the comments below, and there's 2 more reviews for me to do, The Division Bell and The Endless River, and then I will be doing my list on the top 15 Pink Floyd albums, at least in my opinion. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future.